to the Interfaith Domestic Violence Coalition, leaders of faith, all domestic violence survivors, advocates, and attendees, thank you for joining us in this kickoff event. My name is Lyn Twyman. I'm a domestic violence advocate, social activist, and the CEO of Lasers, a domestic violence nonprofit. I am also a mother of 3 beautiful children, and in relation to today's very important event, I am a survivor of child abuse and intimate partner violence. I grew up in a middle-class, 2-parent home, the only child. Growing up, my father was abusive, psychologically, emotionally, and verbally. From the young age of 4, I recall experiencing his abusive behavior. When my mother would leave the room or leave the house, he would say things like she was a whore, she was having an affair, that she didn't care about me, nor did she care about him. Imagine telling a 4, 5, 6-year-old, all the way up until the age of 10, a girl, these things about her mother. To my mother, my father would say and accuse her of the same awful things right in front of me, and would threaten to have her deported. See, my mother is an immigrant. So Dad was nice when he wanted to be, and he could turn it on and off at the drop of a hat. One moment he would be happy, the next depressed, cynical, and threatening. He bought my mother and I very nice things, tried to make our home feel and appear comfortable on the outside. But on the inside, we lived with dysfunction and in isolation. My mother fought hard to stay connected to her family and friends as well as his. We lived in a home with abuse. Eventually, my parents divorced, and when the judge asked me who did I want to live with, I said my dad. Why? Because by the time my father had done a very good job of convincing me that my mother was an unfit parent, that she didn't care about me, that he was the only one I ever needed to trust. So from the ages of 10 to 18, I had moved about 12 different times with my dad and was out of school for 2 years. And from the ages of 10 to 23, that's 13 years, I didn't have a relationship with my mother, nor family because of the psychological abuse. So when it came to my first intimate relationship, I gravitated towards a man that had characteristics like my father, good and bad. What else did I know, right? And this time, not only was he psychologically, emotionally, and verbally abusive, he was physically abusive. He was physically abusive to me. Funny, in both relationships with my dad and with the boyfriend, we went to church. Church was a part of my life. But as a victim, not once was there a domestic violence ministry in all the churches I had attended under the Christian faith, from Catholic to Baptist to non-denominational, from the East Coast to the West. Remember, I moved around a lot, okay? So, let alone a spiritual leader who brought this issue of domestic violence, family violence, abuse to the forefront. See, our relationships are key in every aspect of our lives, whether it's school, work, business, and most importantly at home. So we have an obligation to understand and teach healthy relationships, make it top priority everywhere we go, and especially in places of faith, because places of faith are still seen as the first choice of refuge for those in our communities. I often wonder, had there been domestic violence ministries in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, on up until now, the year 2014, in churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, you name it, as prominent as studying our academic and religious doctrine, how much more different our society would truly be. We must take up the torch and proclaim that educating one another about domestic violence violence, healthy relationships, is something we cannot compromise. How much healthier we would be as ministers, faith leaders, and just everyday individuals. How much healthier our people we minister to would be. Just to give you some history, I am the second generation to experience abuse in my family, to my knowledge. My father was the first. He grew up in a home where he experienced neglect, emotional abuse, as well as physical abuse by both my grandparents. His family was a middle-class family, and they too went to church every week. Lived with a loud praying grandmother who would call all of her children's and grandchildren's names at night in prayer. But because my father faced neglect, criticism, and terrible physical beatings by my grandfather, his dad, that took a very big toll on his mind, emotions, his perception of himself in the world. And when Uncle Sam came a-calling during the Vietnam era, my father's trauma grew even more. The abuse that he experienced as a child festered. As an adult, the cycle continued in him. I'm here today to say, however, that I chose to break the cycle of generational abuse. And through months of counseling and now years of advocacy, I was able to turn my pain into passion and transform my hurt into healing. So when people ask, why are you a domestic violence advocate? I'm able to tell them my story and help them to realize maybe themselves or someone they know is being abused. Because in all honesty, we all know of someone. We may not know exactly what is happening, but we know of someone that is being affected. So now through my program Lasers, I also have created a faith-based domestic violence ministry in Baltimore at Empowerment Temple to help meet the needs that have far too long been lacking in our places of worship. So my challenge to all of us as persons with some vested interest in the domestic violence pandemic, and more so in the faith-based community, is this. We all have gardens we must tend to, and in order to make sure our gardens grow and stay healthy, we must water and nurture them regularly and often as required. You already know there are bugs in the garden and animals ready to devour the garden. You already know this garden is susceptible to disease. Some of those diseases attack the leaves, so it's visible, you can see it. And some diseases attack the roots, making the problem nearly invisible or invisible altogether. To the point that once you recognize there's a problem, it's almost too late to salvage that plant within the garden. We know these problems can and do exist. I was that plant in the garden whose roots were attacked. I was that child that faced abuse, a girl, and transformed into a woman. There are many more women and men with similar stories like mine. I'm not the only one. There are tons of survivors in this room tonight. So we must create an approach that will nurture our gardens, the people that the Creator has placed in our lives to help grow. It starts with addressing domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner violence, relationships with abuse, however you want to say it, and highlighting healthy relationships. Do we as a people understand what is a healthy relationship? I had to ask myself that question. Can we identify one? Have we ever experienced one? Be honest with yourself, especially as survivors. Sometimes we go through so many relationships we don't really know. If not, we have an obligation to learn, then we have an obligation to identify one, then we have an obligation to teach. So learn, know, and teach healthy relationships and educate your community about domestic violence. You are truly the front line, all of us in this room. And for some, the last bit of hope to women, men, and children. And that's my challenge today, from one survivor to all of you. Because had there been a program that existed in my place of worship that I was so faithful to attend, I truly believe I could have been helped much sooner. Let's not be afraid to tackle this issue anymore in the faith-based community. And let's make sure we have thriving domestic violence ministries. None of our congregations have to suffer in silence, as I did. So on behalf of all survivors, I appreciate you for taking up the call to ending domestic abuse